Hi, folks. This is the last episode in Season 5, so do stick around afterwards for some news and updates about the podcast. Throughout this podcast, I've talked to many different people who were involved in the Troubles. From victims, to politicians, to soldiers, to Republicans. But there was always a gap in the podcast, which was hearing about the Troubles from a Loyalist perspective. After some help and a bit of effort, I should be able to get more Loyalists on the podcast who will tell their story. And the first of these stories will be today's conversation with Eddie Kinner. Eddie is from the Shankill in Belfast and joined the Ulster Volunteer Force at a very young age. He then was arrested after carrying out a gun and bomb attack on a bar. He spent a considerable amount of time in prison before coming out and then building a life as an ex-paramilitary. This is his story. This is the Troubles podcast, a podcast about the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. Let's hand it over to Eddie. You'll also hear me chiming in at different points as well.
I'm from the Shankill. I grew up in the Lower Shankill. We moved to Highfield a couple of times, but whenever the Troubles erupted in '69, I lived on the corner of Dover Street and a street called Westmoreland Street. So I was 11. I think a crucial point to make is this, even before that, my memories before that, it was never a normal society. The kind of thing before civil rights and the protests, if you were on a bus and the bus passed the chapel, the Catholics on it crossed themselves and the Protestants, then they were able to identify by who crosses himself and who doesn't, who was Protestant, who was Catholic. And depending on the age group, there would have been some violence. In the picture houses at the end of the night, they played the national anthem, the Queen. And again, whoever didn't stand up, they knew were led the fisticuffs outside. So that was before the eruption of the Troubles.
So this is the early 60s kind of, you're saying, is it?
It would be, aye.
Okay, and like, do you think, like, I guess, when you tell the story of the Troubles, you always kind of say that there was, Northern Ireland was like like a two-tier society or whatever. Did you see that or feel that, or was it more like, you just knew that the Catholics were kind of, they were the enemy, kind of, or as you're growing up as a young person? Or
You were certainly conditioned that they were looking to undermine the state. The civil rights protests are seen as an attempt to bring about a united Ireland, and unionists were pretty much conditioned by unionist politicians to oppose civil rights, particularly in Paisley. He organised the opposition rallies to the civil rights marches. There were some middle-class Protestant students that were involved with the civil rights, but it was predominantly seen as nationalists. They didn't manage to entice disadvantaged Protestants in it, and the Ulster Unionist representatives certainly whipped up tensions within the Unionist community, opposed their civil rights. And the tension before the Troubles erupted was, you could taste it, you could feel it in the air. Just, it was as if it wouldn't take much for all to spark off. Effectively, what happened was, it was a 13th of August in '69 at the bottom of Conway Street. There was a car showrooms that the Falls Road ones petrol bombed and burned it out. So the 14th, there was a burn-in parade. It was going down the Falls and down to Divis Street. All the men, because of the car showrooms being attacked, most of the men in Shankill had congregated at Conway Street, anticipating trouble there. the parade, when it got to Dover Street, tried to come down Dover Street, and there was a handful of women and B specials that prevented them from coming down, and just all hell broke loose from there. Bombay Street as a result of the tensions that was there.
So that was that the same day as the burning of Bombay Street, or was that a bit?
Yeah.
Yeah. When the
15th, they run on the 15th.
Yeah.
15th of August.
Well, that's what I understand. That's the day kind of the lines were a bit more established. Say where Catholic families who lived in Protestant areas were kind of burned out, or are left and deliberately burnt their homes, or it was the setting of the lines in a way.
Both that happened equally on both sides. Pogroms on both sides. But I can remember standing at the corner of Dover Street, watching tracer bullets coming down Dover Street from a nice north end of the Falls. And we were convinced that was the IRA. They would be coming to get us. I later learned, actually, in Long Kesh, that the tracer bullets were coming from the B Specials, Shoreland armoured cars who were shooting above people's heads to try and disperse the crowd. I think that's how the young lad was killed in Divis Flats, because that's unintentional. It was unintentional. It was accidental. Herbie Roy was the first one shot dead.
One more time, the name, sorry?
Herbie Roy.
And then so you're what, like 12, 13 around this time? Are you going to these protests with your dad, or were you guys doing it?
No, I was 11. The next day, I was with 15, 16-year-olds and making petrol bombs, Molotov cocktails, for the next night's riot. And then the army came in, and the army marched up Dover Street, steel helmets and fixed bayonets, and they were behaving more like an invasionary force. They seen the state of Bombay Street, and they were pretty hostile towards the Protestant community. So, that's the eruption of it. It was pretty much barricades went up, but they would have interface regular riots. As a teenager, one of our forms of entertainment would be there was a pub practically in every corner of Shankill then, and we would have pulled up in a pub door and shouted, "Quick, the tigs are coming up Percy Street," and you get a lot of drunks waiting out of the bar. You get to it in the lane of bars, and you get the drunks coming out of the bars, heading for Percy Street, and you see the people in the Falls seeing this crowd coming down Percy Street. Bang, you had a riot. That was our entertainment as teenage kids.
When asked if Eddie came from a Loyalist family, he went on to explain.
October 1969, there was a gun battle took place in the Shankill between the army and Loyalists. And the Constable Arbuckle was shot dead. There was 2 streets that were blocked off. Melbourne Street was one of them. 4 of my uncles were arrested and charged. So my family is steeped in UVF tradition. I used to say I was born into UVF. Effectively the case.
Eddie then began to explain what would eventually lead him into the world of paramilitarism. It began with fighting after football matches, and then teenagers in the area would form into tartan gangs. Tartan refers to the pattern which the gang would wear. Nowadays, most people would associate tartan with a Scottish kilt, but it was different then. Northern Irish historian Gareth Mulvenna has written a fascinating book about the Northern Irish tartan gangs, so do look him up if you want to learn more. Eddie references Gareth in the next segment.
In those days, you knocked about your peers on street corners, and you went to the Linfield matches, and those groups from the street corners were bonded together for the Linfield matches that formed the Shankill Young Tartan. We knocked about in Agnes Street, so we effectively call ourselves the Agnes Street tartan.
Okay, and you dress a certain ways, and if you wear tartan, is this
Tartan scarf.
tartan scarf? Okay.
And that was effectively it. I mean, that's the shirt royal red tartan was Shankill tartan, which still cut a white tartan. And there were also niceness, so that had tartan gangs in New Lodge and Falls. There have been clashes. Gareth has been trying to get information on them, and they're reluctant and hesitant to admit their association with them.
Well, sorry, you see, I know very little about this. So, like, does the tartan represent the team, or is the colour, like, would the nationalist tartan gangs and the unionist tartan gangs be different colours, or the same colours, or...?
No, they had different colours.
Okay, and the tartan represents the football team, is it?
No, the tartan was just, it represented the Shankill Young tartan, the red tartan. That was made up from different areas. In Shankill, historically, there would have been the Hammer, the Mick, the Black Pod, different areas within the Shankill.
Were the tartans carrying out crimes, or was it just more about the gang of people that you hung out with?
Pretty much gangs that would have been responding to any events, or you go down into Smithfield Market looking for Catholics.
And just to get into fights with?
Yeah, pretty much. I would have been mainly all people your own age.
And did your parents mind? Were they happy that you were in the tartan?
Would have been oblivious to it. They wouldn't have known.
Yeah, I need to do a whole episode on the tartan gangs. They sound really interesting. I didn't know anything. I didn't even know there was nationalist tartans. That's very interesting.
Well, Gareth has struggled to get them to admit to any association. He's got some people admitting to some things, but most of them deny it and dismiss it.
So go on, why would they deny it? They don't want, because tartans is associated with the crown, I guess, is it, or what?
No, I don't think so. I just think that if you ask a Republican, they will try to convince you that they were politically motivated and they were politicised pre the experience of their troubles. Whereas for me, I reacted to what was taking place on the ground. I got politicised in Long Kesh. I wasn't really overly politically aware.
Yeah, so you're saying the nationalists argue that it was always political motivations, but in reality it could have just been
reacting to what was taking place. It was all. I mean, both sides reacted with their emotions, not logically. You know.
So hang on, with the tartans, are we talking like, would that be like 71, 72 or?
71. I mean, there's quite a few bombs that had been set off on the Shankill by the Provisional IRA. I was 13 in 1871 when they blew up the Balmoral showrooms, killing 4 people, 2 babies, and a prom. And that, I just lived around the corner from it. I was on the chain digging the rubble. And at that point, I had made my mind up, if I can do this here, I can do that with them. It made me determined to be able to get myself into a position where I could respond in kind.
The youth wing of the UVF was known as the Young Citizen Volunteers, and Eddie explains how he joined them at the age of 14.
I was approached in a disco and asked if I was prepared to join an organisation. They wouldn't tell me the name of the organisation until I committed myself to joining. And I had said, I stipulated that as long as it's not the UDA, it was transpired to be the junior wing of the UVF.
So why didn't you want to join the UDA?
Why did I not want to join it? Because they were involved predominantly in street protests. They weren't actively responding to the IRA. They weren't responding in kind. Effectively, the UVF had explosive expertise. So I would be able to respond in kind if I could get involved with that organisation.
So you say you get approached at a disco. You say to the guy, "Yep, sure, sign me up." And then what happens?
He told me a time and place to go for a meeting. I went along to my first meeting. A group of YCVs, there was about 15 to 20. Some of them I knew, some of them were tartan mates. They had already been members that I wasn't aware of. And they asked for volunteers for operations, and I hadn't volunteered. The guy who had invited me to join them asked me after the meeting. I said, well, I didn't volunteer, and I had said I expect to be trained. So consequently, I got some training.
Was that in guns, or was that in assembling bombs, or was it,
It would have been weapons. It would have been with weapons, guns.
And where do you see, because I guess with the IRA, a lot of the times they just go across the border and they do their gun training over in Donegal or somewhere. So where do you do it if you're,
There were remote farms where you'd be taken to practice shooting. Gradually introduced, you'd be starting off by gathering intelligence, taking registration numbers of cars going in and out of nationalist areas, passing information on. And then you would have got involved with robberies. A crucial thing that we did was take personal protection weapons from RUC reservists, UDR men. They had personal protection weapons, and we would have, one of the methods that we would have armed ourselves. It was, we never considered the risk of getting into one of our houses armed, and they're not going to know that you're not a provisional IRA man coming to shoot them.
They would basically be, they'd shoot first because obviously you're not going to identify yourself. Yeah.
I mean, we had a guy who was an insurance salesman that he would have gathered any information. He had been talking to the people in the firearm holders, and he had got out of me where exactly the firearm was, and so you were well tuned into how to proceed whenever you get into the building. Make sure you keep them away. Make sure you keep them away from the location you've been informed as to where the weapon's stored.
Eddie then talked about signing up to plant a bomb in Conway's bar in Belfast, which would lead to the death of UVF bomber Geordie Brown and Catholic civilian Marie Doyle.
Well, effectively, come 1975, I'd volunteered to plant a bomb. Planting the bomb exploded prematurely, killing one of my comrades and killing a woman in the bar.
And if you don't mind me, if we go back a little bit, Eddie, sorry, just so say you volunteered, do you have any part in assembling the bomb or anything, or no? They give it to you and they say, drop this there.
Well, the gig, you might then collect it at a specific location. In those days, there'd have been, I suppose it wouldn't be much different, but the bomb would have been probably prepared to go on different locations, and because there's been security forces present, the operation would have been called off. So I suspect that the fuse in the bomb, they told us it was 40 seconds on the fuse, and we could cut the fuse in half, reduce it to 20 seconds. We never touched it, but at the trial, the full capacity of the bomb didn't explode, and that there was something wrong with the fuse. I suspect that they moved about that often. There was a kink that must have come into the fuse that caused a jump.
So what was the name of the guy you were with?
The guy that was killed?
Yeah.
Geordie Brown.
Geordie Brown. So you and Geordie approached, what was it, Conway's bar. You drop it at the doorstep, you light the fuse, and then you expected 40 seconds, but then it just went off straight away.
There were two, Geordie Brown and Maurice Nunn was the other one, with revolvers, and they were, if security guards were to turn up to try and interfere, then they were to shoot them. But we were told, don't be shooting into the bar. I let the fuse up on. The bar door opened, and I started blasting. And the time that it takes to fire off 6 rounds, because I had just stepped back, I said, "Let's go," and the bomb just went flying through the air and bounced off a security fence. I still had the lighter in my hand, and down beside me was George B. Brown with his foot blew off, chest and head injuries, and there was a drain. I knelt down beside him and dropped the lighter down the drain.
But you were quite injured as well, weren't you? Your face, I think, was quite burnt. Yeah. So what happened? Does the police arrive? Does an ambulance arrive? Do people come out? Does a crowd try and attack you or anything? Or, you know?
Well, they assumed I was one of the innocent. So they escorted me, helped me in the ambulance. Marty's experience was different. He had run. His back was on fire. The crowd ran after him, caught him, beating him. The army had came on the scene. He was handed over to the army. The army beat him a bit, and then he was handed over to the police. They slapped him about and took him to his cell before taking him to hospital.
In the aftermath of this attack, Eddie was taken to the hospital before ending up in prison, where he came face to face with Gusty Spence, who was also in the prison. I've done an episode on Spence in the past, but he would be considered a senior figure in the UVF and was beloved by many UVF loyalists. Gusty knew Eddie's family quite well and attended Eddie's grandfather's funeral. Gusty warned Eddie not to speak to the police when questioned. Then it came to the day of the trial, where Eddie was sentenced to 18 years for causing the explosion. Because Eddie was 17 when he carried out the attack, he was detained during the Secretary of State's pleasure, which more or less meant that he would be imprisoned for an indeterminate length of time. I asked Eddie what was life like in prison.
The Crumlin Road experience was pretty horrific the last week there, because at that day, in March 1976, they stopped special category status. So I was housed for up until March. Last week in February, I was housed with UVF, UDA and law prisoners, awaiting my board paper petition to move me to grant me special category status and move me to Long Kesh.
What do you mean? Sorry. So say in Crumlin Road, you were with UVF and UDA prisoners waiting for your application. But so what would you be in Long Kesh?
C-Wing was Loyalist paramilitaries at the time. The last week in February, as each group of prisoners attended court, instead of coming back to Crumlin Road Jail, they moved in back to a compound in Long Kesh because they were doing away with special category status. So it meant that I was at the first week in March 1976, I was the only prisoner in C-Wing. The second week, they introduced what they call ODCs, or ordinary decent criminals. So I refused to come out of a cell to associate with them, or be associated with them. And the screws come in and beat the crap out of me. Complaints went in and pressure was applied to get my petition responded to. And the second week I was moved down to Long Kesh.
And in either prison, did you come into contact with Republican prisoners much, or was it completely kept totally different?
In the Crum, you rarely got any contact. If there was any contact, they would have resorted to violence. If there was any, that was a regular thing. In Long Kesh, Gusty had established a camp council with representatives from all the different factions, meeting and cooperating to try and improve the conditions in Long Kesh. And there was like a no first strike policy. You were not allowed to lift your hands to the opposition. If you did, you would have been put out of a compound.
So I do remember, like, say in the was it the blanket protests and the dirty protests and the hunger strike. I think in the initial stages, the Loyalists and the Republican prisoners were striking together. to return for the return of special category status. But then that, as I think the Republican strikes escalated, I think the Loyalists then didn't want to be. I think it was called off work. The combined campaign, I guess.
One of the Loyalists that was on that hunger strike or on that blanket protest tells a really, really good story about his experience on it and the pressure that he had come under to get him to come off it. It's an excellent story. I mean, it's powerful.
Eddie believes that he had his political awakening while in prison. So I asked him to explain this a little bit.
Effectively, Gusty never asked me it, but he had a question that he asked just most prisoners whenever they came through the gate along Kesh. Why are you here? He didn't ask me because he knew my whole family background. He knew precisely my complete pedigree, so he didn't bother asking me the question. And effectively, most people were thinking he was asking what they were in for and responding to because it was caught. And effectively, no. His question was, "No, why are you here? What motivated you to do what you did?" It forced quite a few. In Company 21, we were in. It forced quite a lot of us to question our circumstances or scenarios. In my case, I had already begun that questioning process anyway. The day that I was sentenced, there was a whole uproar. Whenever we were sentenced, the whole crowd of men had been in YCVs, had been in the gallery, and they started clapping and cheering. And the screws get us down the stairs and into holding cell. At that point, I was looking around. Everything that was abusing me was carrying the British crown. It's not a question that at that stage I was prepared to ask openly, but I recognise there's something not right. There's something not right that in here, trying to retain that link, being abused by him. That process was there. So whenever Gusty encouraged it in Long Kesh in Company 21, we were encouraged to debate and discuss different directions, different options, and how we think things should be in a prison camp. Cooperating with our enemy to improve our conditions. If we can do that there, why can we not do the same outside? That to me was the genesis of the peace process. The camp council that Gusty had pulled together all the different factions. That's where the roots lie of the peace process.
What was the funny? Where did I come across this? Maybe it was on The Blanket by Ricky O'Raw. I'm sure you know. But what did he say? There was one, I think the Loyalists caught a Republican prisoner digging his way out of a cell. But he'd accidentally dug into the Loyalist part, and they said, no, you're going the wrong way. So they said, you need to go. They didn't like attack him. They just said, no, look, if you're on an escape, you have to go the other direction. I don't think he escaped. There was lots of escapes. This wasn't one of them. While in prison, Eddie passed his GCSE exams and was offered a chance at enrolling in Open University, which is a university you can do in the prison. He was reticent at first, but once he realised that it would be an extra expense for the prison, he decided to go for it. Eventually, Eddie went on to receive a licence of release from prison. I asked how long his sentence was in total.
I would classify it more as 13 and a half years, 14 years, because the last 9 months I was on the streets. They have a working out scheme. I'm going to write something about it as well, but they have a working out scheme where the first 3 months you get paroles and try to seek employment with those 5 paroles that you get. The next 3 months you go out to work, come back to jail at night and get home the weekends. The next 6 months, sometimes it gets extended to 9 months. You get out to work, stay at home, but you come back to jail every week to get a parole form signed.
And did you have a family at this stage, or were you going back to your parents' house, or
back to my parents' house?
Upon his release, I asked him did he rejoin the UVF or had his priorities changed?
The UVF certainly don't want you back in the ranks because you're an unknown entity, so therefore you're a danger. So therefore they just left because you're an indeterminate sentence prisoner. Your license could be taken off you at any time. So they didn't want to endanger that. So they left you to your own devices. What I did was there was a community centre with a gym, boxing club in it, and fitness was a big thing, and as well as education. So I went into the boxing club. Bobby Story's brother, Jerry Story, came into compounds to teach us, train us as boxing coaches.
During the Troubles?
Yeah.
Bobby Story was a well-known member of the Provisional IRA, so it sounded unusual for his brother to arrive into a gym in a Loyalist area. But in this case, boxing was the priority for the men, not politics. Eddie enjoyed his time at the club, which was often looking for government funding, and he used his experience applying for grants and funding while in prison to advise the boxing club on how to get more funding. He intended to stay on with the club on a management level, but there was a government legislation which said that any community group which had paramilitaries working on their management committees would not receive any funding. So he continued to give them advice, but not in an official capacity. Though there were a number of government programmes, as well as programmes on the Shankill for ex-paramilitaries to find jobs, Eddie found it quite difficult. He eventually found a job with a company who make diesel generators.
They invited me up for a job interview. When I get up to the job interview, I was handed an application form, and I had to go through that, and there's a part in it about have you any convictions. So that threw a dilemma at me. Yeah, declare a conviction. If I don't declare it, and it comes out vulnerable, they can get rid of me at the slightest that I win. If I do declare a conviction, I'm here for an interview now, so see what they say. So I declared my conviction on the interview. They quizzed me about it, and they raised concerns on their part that I may be disruptive in the workforce. And I reassured them that the only way they'll know is if they give me an opportunity. And they give me the opportunity. I ended up working on their computer systems for about 1991.
Yeah, so just a good few years anyway to get you into kind of just meaningful employment, I think. Yeah.
Yep, I mean, that was me and a plan. The mathematics and computing skills. It was a computer. I was in their drawing office. I was managing the development software that managed their drawing, their CAD drawings.
Eddie ended up becoming a part of the political party known as the Progressive Unionist Party, aka the PUP. And I asked him why he decided to step into politics and why he didn't join the UUP or the DUP, the two largest unionist parties in Northern Ireland.
After the Frizzell's bombing the Shankill, Plum Smith called a meeting of about 15 to 20 ex-UVF Red Home prisoners that were engaged in different areas of community work. The meeting in Oldville Resource Centre. President at the meeting was David Irvine. I went along to a meeting assuming Plum was going to establish a working class left wing alternative to Ulster Unionists and the DUP.
And why were the UUP and the DUP seen as two middle class or something, or what's the kind of big difference? I guess
the UUP were notoriously middle class. The DUP were that stage would have been predominantly dominated by a Free Presbyterian Church. So I mean, their emphasis was on the religion rather than on the real politics. So I had assumed that was Plum's intention to put on a left wing, develop a left wing group of politicians, and I hadn't considered the PUP. But whenever Davy was present, Davy had says, "Look, these are all ex-UVF Red Home prisoners. If you join the PUP and give them voice, you may be able to influence UVF the ceasefire."
And that was your goal?
It was, yeah, trying. One of the objectives of joining the PUP would have been to influence the UVF along the peace process.
We then moved on to the peace process in Northern Ireland. Eddie explained that by the early 90s, many prisoners who had been given indeterminate sentences were being released. And Eddie believes that the release of those prisoners sowed the seeds for peaceful discourse.
Again, I hold my roots. The roots of the peace process are in the Long Kesh and the Camp Council. And that coming out, and people with the experience of that coming out knew how to cooperate. And I mean, the Quaker asking us about the difficulties that we had reintegrating back into the community asked us, would we be, as 1981, would we be prepared to meet with Republicans to try and work together to try and obtain funding for setting up centres for reintegrating the prisoners coming out. Centres that would be managed by their own people, by the ones that had the experience. So we had met, we had agreed that we would meet with them, and from 91 the peace process really started. We were in contact, had regular meetings, and during those meetings, Tony Catney would have been one of the Republican representatives, and Billy Hutchison, he reported back the discussions of the meetings to the UVF. Tony reported his back to Provost, and they acted like a liaison between those two organisations, getting statements interpreted in the way they're intended. And it was a behind the scene form of communication that was taking place that nobody would have knew about.
As the peace talks were underway, Eddie was a member of the PUP, and his job was to travel around Northern Ireland and talk with those who were dead set against the negotiations from going through.
I was key member of the Progressive Unionist Party at that time. There would have been meetings held across the country to try and interpret events as they were happening, and the PUP and the UVF would have went across the country trying to deal with concerns and fears that were being raised by the anti-agreement negotiators even.
In the wake of the Good Friday Agreement, Eddie believes that there are some serious holes, especially when it comes to what's known as the Civic Forum.
Well, I mean, you constantly hear people heaping up that the Good Friday Agreement has failed. It was a farce, and it certainly fuel has out of date. You probably wouldn't get unionists that voted for the yes vote now for the yes vote again, given their experience of it. When realistically, as far as I'm concerned, the Good Friday Agreement has not ever been implemented. In order to get the DUP on board, it was renegotiated in Hillsborough. They did away with the Civic Forum. They reduced the number of MLAs. There's quite a few things that haven't been implemented, and they pretty much divided it along sectarian lines. Oh, and another crucial point that Davy Irvine had made, and it tends to get forgotten about, is Tony Blair had stated that he would facilitate the politicisation and transition of Republicans, and the police could deal with Loyalists. Well, they weren't going to assist or facilitate the transition of Loyalists into politics and community development. The police could deal with Loyalists. The emphasis was on the Loyalists would become gangs. That's pretty much the mentality and the view. You know, the whole perspective out there is that what we did in prison was weightlift and read porn.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna quote you in the first email you sent back to me that let's see, you want to challenge the Neanderthal iron pumping porn addict perception of Loyalists. So you think that most people around the world or most people are biased and think Loyalists are all just a bunch of feckin', I don't know.
Yeah.
You believe the perception is completely wrong.
The perception is of Johnny Adair type. Any constructive Loyalists, you don't hear the positive stuff that's being done in Loyalist communities by ex-Loyalist prisoners. You don't hear them invited into anything constructive. You just hear them getting condemned.
And do you think ex-Republican prisoners they're treated differently?
Yeah.
Why is that?
They've been successful politically, for starters. They've wiped out their opposition in the SDLP, established unionist politicians feel threatened and determined by articulate Loyalists and don't want to see them developing. So we're held back by our own representatives. I'll give you an example of a bit of experience. Before the agreement was reached, we would be getting invited to all around different places to put forward our political policies and where we went. So myself, Gary McMichael, the UDP, and Willie Ross from the Ulster Unionist Party, we'd been invited to Guildhall in Derry to put across unionist positions and views. A group of teenagers, not sure whether they were mixed religiously or all from one section, I don't know. But the DUP never went in, just wouldn't take part in it. But I had detected the teenagers getting bored, and I started to raise the emphasis on the importance of education. And that picked up their ears a wee bit. They got a bit interested. But what made it even more interesting was Willie Ross's position. And he was opposed to disadvantaged working class people gaining third level education. He associated disadvantaged and working class people obtaining education with the civil rights in America and student riots in France, and that's he used as his example as what happens whenever you educate those who shouldn't be educated. So that was the mentality of the Ulster Unionist Party, and that mentality still exists out there.
So you think right now the unionist politicians' worst enemy is themselves?
Doug Beattie, I think, is making all the right noises on behalf of the Ulster Unionist Party now. When he was leader, because he's realising that you need to appeal to everybody, not just one section of our community, and you need to be seen to be working for everybody.
And do you feel the DUP just never did that?
No. But the DUP are trying to do it, I think, now. But I think they're trying to do it now to some degree. I think they're learning.
I asked Eddie how he felt about the British government and if he felt that they prioritised Northern Irish Unionists.
I would say we're at the very back. I think the DUP are responsible for the border issue. If they had I can't remember, was it Theresa May? If they had supported her over Boris,
when they had a bit of power, the DUP had a huge, just before Brexit or something, or before the vote, they had a huge amount of power,
Yeah. And they swallowed Boris Johnson's lies, went behind him, and he totally backstabbed him. So that's an indication of the contempt that unionists are treated with by the British government.
Eddie went on to explain that many unionists had a deep mistrust of Sinn Féin.
I think unionists haven't adapted sufficiently to outmaneuver Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin's position is this is the failed state, so they're not going to help to make it work. All they're doing is trying to create a situation where the unionists pull it down, and they're saying, "We've tried these people, can't work." They want it down. The Shinners want it down, but it has to go down at the hands of unionists. So unionists need to be prepared to watch out for the trap.
And what the unionists want to do then, hold up the state or reaffirm their role with Great Britain or a working state,
There'll be some unionists that would advocate being ruled from Westminster. Direct rule, they would see that as a better option. That's a short-sighted option, and it's not going to change anything. Really, they need to develop a strategy to interlink Sinn Féin and wanting storm out to work.
Eddie made an interesting point regarding the Civic Forum, which was meant to be set up after the Good Friday Agreement.
The intentions behind it, because it had been scrapped.
This is one of the terms of the Good Friday Agreement that didn't happen in the end. Okay, so go on.
It was initially established, but whenever the Sinn Féin and the DUP carved up a deal in Hillsborough, the Good Friday Agreement pretty much totally rewritten. So there's no point in saying, what has been implemented now was not the Good Friday Agreement. And the Civic Forum was made up from community representatives and a number of politicians, but it was configured in such a way that, whenever any difficult policies were being recommended in Stormont, they had to go to the Civic Forum for them to be able to say, well, there's no way you're going to sell at the nationalist community, and there's no way you're going to sell at the loyalist community. You have to develop that in a way that the Civic Forum go back to their communities and say, this is the way this is intended, and get it into a format that both communities can accept. To me, it's a crucial element that I was involved in the negotiations that negotiated the Civic Forum. So whenever it was scrapped, it was that's elected representatives are making the decisions, and that's it. And it's seen as winners and losers, rather than this is something we all need, we all require.
As collusion plays such a part in the Troubles, I put the question to Eddie. In his paramilitary life, did he ever see British soldiers or intelligence forces colluding with UVF paramilitaries? The audio quality of his response wasn't great, but he basically said that he thinks it's all made up. I then asked him about the Glenanne gang, and he believes that it's all hype and that the accusations made by John Weir is a thing of fantasy.
I think the Glenanne gang information's all hype. There's a guy who is currently writing a book about the UVF, and he's had extensive access to quite a number of UVF people. And he had that question posed to him, and he just totally blows it out of the water. He's able to quote contradictions. Some of John Weir's stuff is fantasy and can't be proved.
The final question I put to Eddie was to ask him what he wanted to see for Northern Ireland over the next 10 years.
I'd like to see people working together to improve it.
That brings us to the end of this interview with Eddie Kinner. I want to thank him for coming on and telling us his story. This also brings us to the end of Season 5 of the podcast. So what is the future of the Troubles podcast? I still can't believe that after 80 or so episodes, space keeps opening up for me to make more and carry out interviews like today's one with Eddie. As it stands, I still have a multitude of interviews that I'm working on getting out, probably a little bit too slowly. I've one about NORAID, one on the East Tyrone Brigade of the IRA, one about understanding loyalism from a political perspective, and the most recent one I carried out, which saw a PSNI officer shot in the stomach by dissident Republicans. There are so many stories to tell, and each one leads into about 5 more. The future is still bright for this podcast. There are still plenty more episodes in the tank, and the only hard part is to get me to sit down and actually write the episodes. But do watch this space, because over the next month or two, I'm partnering up with the Northern Irish company Visual Antics, and we're going to be launching some really nice Troubles podcast apparel. So t-shirts, jumpers, or sweaters for my American listeners, caps and beanies. So do keep an eye out for those. I'm also still slowly working away on a project about the Middle East, and after months of meandering, I finally put pen to paper on it. And it seems like the best place to start the podcast is the Sykes-Picot line. If anybody wants to come on board and help write it, shoot me a message. I could certainly use some accountability. I'm still kicking around the idea of doing another live show in Dublin too, if I got the guest right. Last year's one was great crack, and it was really cool to finally meet listeners of the podcast in person. I'll also probably be launching a Troubles walking tour around Dublin at some stage this year. As always, if you want to come on the podcast and tell your story, or even suggest an interview, please do let me know. But please stop suggesting Jerry Adams, because I've got 2 requests to his camp and I don't think he'll be coming on the podcast anytime soon. I'll be taking a couple of months off to prepare for Season 6, and I'll also be jumping into the touring season. My main job is as a private driver guide around Ireland, where I give multi-day tours of groups up to 6 people who are usually from the USA. It's a hard job, but I love it, and much of this podcast was written or edited in a random pub or B&B around Ireland when I was finished driving for the day. On that note, if you are looking for a luxury private tour of Ireland, that's also something I can do. So feel free to message me at troublespodcast@gmail.com. And if you've gotten something out of this podcast and want to support it, I'll still be active over on Patreon during the off-season. Right now you can sign up and you will have access to over 50 videos where I talk about episodes as well as news in Northern Ireland. I also have a couple of Patreon exclusive episodes specifically about music of the Troubles over there. I'll probably be doing another book club in the off-season, so it definitely is well worth checking out. If you want to support this podcast in a different way, you can always leave a review wherever you leave reviews, or even throw a story up on your socials and give it a tag. Every bit helps me grow this into what it has become. Lastly, after all of that, I want to thank you for listening and sticking with the podcast all these years. This podcast is probably one of the things in my life that I'm most proud of, and I have you, the listener, to thank for that. So enough waffle. That's it from me. Thanks, and see you next time.